When I first moved to the Atlanta area, Masjid al-Momineen in Clarkston, Georgia was made up of two old rundown houses in the middle of a gravel parking lot. Masjid al-Momineen's community was mostly from East Africa, primarily Somalia. Many of them were refugees and many of them were very poor. Yet, 2 decades later, Masjid al-Momineen is a large, beautiful masjid built from the ground up. On the contrary, many of the predominantly Black American masajid, or mosques, that I knew from my childhood have really not changed much. Why is this? Why do immigrant Muslim communities grow and expand over time while so many Black American Muslim communities remain the same year after year, decade after decade? Over the years, I've worked for and with several different American Muslim communities, both predominantly Black American and predominantly immigrant. I'm going to share some of my observations regarding why Black American Muslim communities just don't seem to advance as much as those of our brothers and sisters from overseas. Now, we have a few caveats. No community is perfect. All Muslim communities have a lot of work to do and are often under tremendous stress. Many of the people who work in these masajid are volunteers who put in a lot of unpaid hours to make the masjid run smoothly. Another caveat is that this is not a scientific study. I have not visited every masjid in the country, so you will find exceptions to every rule. Again, I have to reiterate, these are my observations as a former insider. Another caveat, I want to explain what we mean when I use the phrase Black Muslim community or immigrant Muslim community. I really don't like using those phrases, but I really couldn't think of another word or phrase to use to describe these two groups. I consider a Black Muslim community to be a masjid or a Muslim community where the dominant population on Jumu'ah, that is on Friday prayer, is made up of Black people with at least 3 generations in the United States, and the leadership is predominantly Black. On the other side, I consider an immigrant Muslim community as one where the dominant population on Jumu'ah Friday is made up of people whose grandparents were born in a foreign nation. Now, what about white Muslims? Well, the number of white Americans who convert to Islam, while it is growing, is still relatively small. And those white Americans who do convert to Islam usually gravitate towards immigrant communities. There is an exception: white American Salafis. White American Salafis will still try to attend and become a part of Salafi masajid or Salafi communities, even if those communities are predominantly Black. And they will try to be a part of a Salafi masjid, even if it's in the inner city. Most Black masajid are located in the inner city, and many of the people who attend these mosques will come from the immediate area. All American masajid are run on donation. Black Americans, on average, have less wealth than other groups. This graph shows that Black Americans generally have significant less wealth than their white or Asian American counterparts. Furthermore, as we can see from this graph, Asian Americans have one of the highest incomes. And as it turns out, most immigrant Muslims to the United States come from Asian countries. For us as Black American Muslims, simply taking the Shahada doesn't change the reality of being Black in America. Simply put, Black Muslim communities are poorer in general because Black Americans are poorer in general. However, that doesn't explain why the Somali Americans at Masjid al-Momineen were able to build that new masjid. As I mentioned, many of these Somali Americans were often refugees, and many of them were very poor. So there's more to it than just access to financial resources. Immigrant Muslim communities tend to settle in the same geographic area of whatever city or metro area they move to. They will often establish a masjid in their neighborhood close to where they live. Black American Muslims, however, will follow the pattern of most other Americans. Generally, we will live in the best area we can afford that is still convenient for work, school, and other priorities. Therefore, black Muslims tend to be more spread out. Yes, some will live in the inner city, but many will also live in the suburbs. Most black Muslims do not live within walking distance of their favorite masjid, and many predominantly black masajid are located in the inner city. So for black American Muslims, even if the inner city masjid is our favorite masjid, if that's where we grew up, if we have the resources, more often than not, we will move to a better neighborhood. We may come to the inner city masjid for Friday prayers or maybe for special events, but when the prayer is over, when the event is over, we're going back to the suburbs. Now, why is this important? Muslims who live closer to the masjid are more likely to be involved in that masjid outside of Friday. They will have a greater sense of ownership and belonging to that masjid, specifically for special events and daily prayers. Hundreds of Somali Americans live within walking distance of Masjid al-Momineen in Clarkston. Compare the numbers in attendance for Salatul Fajr or Salatul Isha, that's the morning and night prayers, at an immigrant masjid to a black American masjid. The attendance at an immigrant masjid is more often than not much greater. Now, to be fair, some of this has to do with culture. Immigrant Muslims have a legacy of multiple generations of Islam, but I also believe this discrepancy in masjid attendance has a lot to do with location. Since many black Muslims live in the suburbs, they will attend the daily prayers at the closest masjid, and more often than not, that will not be a black masjid. Once again, Salafis are the exception. Salafis often choose to live close to a masjid that follows the Salafi minhaj, even if that masjid is in the inner city. Also, coincidentally, daily prayers at Salafi masajid, even those that are predominantly black, tend to have greater attendance than other black masajid, at least in my experience. Immigrant Muslims within any given community will tend to follow the same Islamic ideology or madhab. If they're from the subcontinent, they'll be Hanafi. If they're from West Africa, they'll be Maliki. If they're from East Africa, they'll be Shafi'i. Black American Muslims do not have the same cohesion and are much more fragmented. I believe there are three main groups of black American Muslims: those who follow Imam W.D. Muhammad, those who are Salafis, and everybody else. That final group, the everybody else, that group is very diverse ideologically. Some may lean more towards Sufism, some may lean more towards Salafism, they may or may not follow any specific madhab. What this means is that even though the number of black Muslims may be very large, their resources are divided. The greater cohesion within immigrant communities makes it easier for them to unite for major projects and causes. Now, you may not want to hear this, but many black masajid are just not run very well. Very often, they started decades ago around a single charismatic imam. These masjid are often run by the imam's inner circle. And this leads to cliques and those who are in the group and those who are outside the group. And the imam and his inner circle tend to run everything. This leads to people having responsibilities that they're not really suited for. And when the imam dies or when he retires, the community then suffers a leadership crisis. Now, immigrant masajid have these same issues with cliques and all. However, since they're often run like proper non-profit organizations, the board of directors or the shura committee rotates more frequently. You have less authority concentrated within one individual. Black Americans are still American, and American culture is very individualistic. Black Americans and Americans in general don't have the deep family connections that many immigrant communities have. The concept of the extended family coming together for a common cause is really not very American. Think about it. How many black American family-owned businesses do you know of? Probably not that many. Compare that to how many immigrant family-owned businesses you know of. Black American Muslims carry a lot of this individualism as well. An example is the susu. I'm not going to explain what a susu is, but I'll include a link to the definition in the description. Many immigrant Muslims organize a susu within their community. This allows them to make large purchases or make large investments without getting into debt. So they can start a business or buy houses without having to rely on a loan from a bank. And here's the kicker: outsiders are not allowed to join that susu. Now, I have known Black American Muslims who have participated in susus, but they were usually much smaller in scale. This is just one example of where the culture of American individualism is holding Black American Muslims back. We have to remember that Black American Muslims are a minority within a minority. Most of us do not have Muslim grandparents. It might take multiple generations for Islamic values to become deeply ingrained in our culture. So there's not much we can do about many of the problems that I've already mentioned. We can't do much about the fragmentation of the Black Muslim community. There's not much we can do about how the local masjid is run, but we can try to diminish the tendency towards individualism. As Americans, individualism is ingrained in our psyche. But as Black Americans, we are also at the bottom of the economic ladder. Individualism and poverty is a bad combination. We'll spend our entire lives trying to build our way out of poverty, and many of us will never make it. Our children will wind up doing the same thing. We have to break this cycle, and you can start with your own family. We have to adopt more Islamic family values. For instance, men and women, brothers and sisters, you have to maintain your chastity until marriage. Promiscuity and extramarital relationships are one of the worst things for families. And once you are married, don't be so quick to divorce. Try to hold on to your marriage as long as possible. Try to send your children to an Islamic school. If that's not possible, try to homeschool them yourself. And if that's not possible, then put them in a weekend Islamic school. Also, don't put your children out of the house when they turn 18. Unless they're involved in haram behavior, encourage your children to live with you until they're married, especially your girls. We have to reject the parts of American culture that do not align with Islam. So brothers, work on improving your financial standing because Allah orders us to provide for the women in our family. We have to reject this red pill ideology and embrace the idea of becoming family men. Sisters, Allah orders you to obey your husband. Reject feminism and embrace the patriarchy. Remember, individualism and poverty is a bad combination. I believe, and Allah knows best, but I believe that building stronger Muslim families will, over time, improve our financial position. Now, there's also a lot we can do to improve our individual masajids, but I'll leave that for another day. Most importantly, remember, we are Muslims first. Before we are Black, before we are American, we are Muslim. So trust in Allah, obey His commandments, and stick to the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.